Hello everybody, I'm Philip J. Watt and this is the Conscious Society YouTube channel. Today we've got Steve Keen. He's come back on our show. He was our first guest on the program. For those who don't know him, he's written a book called Debunking Economics. He's a leading, I guess, anti-economist is what I remember him calling himself in our first interview. He's a professor at the Kingston University in London. He appears on many different alternative and progressive type TV shows, such as the Kaiser Report, and also I saw him on The Renegade as well. So welcome back to the program, Steve.
Good to be here. Yep.
Now, I think we should get straight into it because there is a lot of concern in the alternative media. If you look at places like Zero Hedge, where they're showing some of the economic data, the real fundamental data, you go to Shadow Stats, you see some of the true unemployment rates. There is a lot of concern around the fragility of this global economy and the Fiat system that we have today. So what's your take on it? Where are we and where do you think we're headed?
Okay, well, we're post a debt crisis, a private debt crisis. And the problem is, first of all, the private debt crisis wasn't seen by the mainstream because they don't believe there can be such a thing. And even after one happened, of course, it's a bit like being struck by a meteor when you don't believe there are such things that can fall from the sky. So you continue looking around trying to find what Zeus may have done to explain the strange shaking of the ground that occurred. That's the state the mainstream is in. And then it's not something which is coordinated globally in terms of where the dynamic comes from. So there are some countries that managed to sidestep the crisis by basically continuing the bubble. And those ones are in the early days of facing a crisis. And I see Australia as one of those, as well as Canada, two of the resource exporting developed countries. But the rest of the global economy is post the crisis. So what they're suffering from is either stagnant or declining levels of private debt, meaning that there's credit growth rather than being positive is either very close to zero or negative, taking demand out of the economy, and therefore with demand growing slowly, so do the economies. So that's the state we're in right now. And frankly, I mean, I've normally been a bit of a critic of Bitcoin, as you may have heard, because I just see technical problems with Bitcoin. But this experience of just seeing how the people in charge of fiat money are making a total fist of it, even though I technically believe it can work, is making me more and more convinced that parallel currencies and other things like that are the way to go. Not just because there are sort of fundamental problems with fiat money, which is where a lot of critics come from, but because we've got a bunch of, not so much morons, I suppose it's being unfair, in charge of fiat economy, but very bright people who believe a moronic theory in charge of fiat money, which is why we're seeing such total stuff-ups.
I'll get into the gold-backed currency system that we used to have in a moment, but is this like a new Japan? Japan's economy has been stagnant for so long. So do you see that's where we're headed in terms of US, Europe, and potentially Australia as well?
Exactly. And I first said that I first talked about turning Japanese in the first edition of Debunking Economics that I read in 2000, and said, okay, well, if we go through the same dynamics of having a private debt bubble that then bursts without knowing why it bursts, with the mainstream not understanding it, we'll turn Japanese. And that's exactly what's happened. A well-functioning capitalist economy normally has private credit growth, making a major contribution to where demand comes from. When you get the levels of credit Japan gets to, that demand evaporates, and you then have demand coming just out of the turnover of existing money, which is not enough to generate demand to employ the growing economy, both in terms of increasing technological capability and more labour. So you get caught in a slump, and that's where we've fallen into exactly the same trap and are making exactly the same mistakes, slightly different mistakes, but very, very comparable mistakes that are keeping us in this trap well after we could have got out of it.
Is part of that trap NIRT, or negative interest rates, as well as moving into a cashless society?
This is more a case, again, of a bunch of astronomers who don't understand the universe but have a theory about it all the same, being struck by meteors, which they believe can't happen, and are then puzzled about the event and try to explain it after the event. So negative interest rates are a sign of a bunch of managers of fiat money who don't understand fiat money. Zero interest rates itself is a consequence of this same problem. QE, as they practice, is also a sign of people who don't understand money trying to manage money. So all these things are portents of our fiat money rulers not understanding fiat money. That's really where the problem comes from.
You said that the people who manage this money don't know what they're doing, but when you consider 2008 was one of the largest wealth transfers in our history, with the trillions of dollars of bank bailouts, and then QE in response to that over the last sort of 7 years, and that is being funded by the public through the government, then could they be very aware of what they're doing and doing this to I guess increase their own wealth?
No. The banks are in a position to move very quickly after they make a total stuff up. Okay, and banks have got the politicians by the balls, frankly. The politicians, their entire social milieu is being surrounded by bankers. They've come to believe that banks are an essential part of capitalism, and the bigger your banking sector, the better. And so the whole mental framework of the politicians is, if there's a banking crisis, we have to rescue the banks. And that's where the banks have got the advantage. When the crisis first occurred in 2007, 2008, banks didn't make money out of it. A lot of bankers lost their jobs. They got wiped out. Remember Lehman Brothers and Barings, etc., etc. HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland. The initial impact was to wipe them out. So they certainly weren't ready for this. Okay. But after it happened, having the ear of the politicians, and you can see this in Obama's very first major speech on the issue too, their attitude can be, oh, if we don't rescue the banks, the whole economy will collapse. The world will end. The sky is falling. The sky is falling. Quick, let's hold it up. How do you hold it up? You lift up the bankers again. So all the things like the TARP, I forgot what TARP actually, the Troubled Assets Rescue Program, or whatever it was called, was supposed to provide money for the Main Street, as Michael Hudson calls it. Instead, once the money was there, $700 billion, the bankers were in a position to persuade, as they did, Paulson and friends, to put the money their way rather than putting it to the public. So it's responding to a catastrophe they caused quickly and having the ear of the politicians to persuade them to do it, rather than any preconceived strategy worked out 3 or 4 moves in advance.
Well, as part of capitalism, you know, the weaker link gets sort of flushed out, and many people call the QE for the quantitative easing policies as socialism for the rich. But it's sort of it's sort of ironic when anybody who mentions something like helicopter money or QE for the people, that they say, no, you can't do that. That's socialism. Well, we've already been doing something very, very similar for the higher classes of our society. And there's no doubt there's a lot of cancer and dysfunction within the banking industry itself. So before we move on to QE for the people or helicopter money, because I do want to talk about that, I just want to quickly ask what your thoughts are around the Baltic Dry Index and its collapse, the commodity collapses, or your copper and whatnot, and oil, of course, as well. What's your take on the way that trade is moving around the world right now, and do you see problems that could emerge from the decreased action that's happening within the global economy in that context?
Yeah, well, partly that's because a huge part of this, the Baltic Index and co-op being sustained after 2008 was China. And China's enormous purchases of resources around the world, and all those ships, if you look which direction they were heading full towards China and empty back. Now, of course, they're not going towards China at all. So that huge sustenance that China gave to global trade is disappearing. And that's a far more accurate indication of the state of affairs in China than China's published statistics. Which if you believe China's published statistics about most things, and I'd like to show you a couple of bridges. My favorite Chinese statistic, by the way, is the unemployment rate. You know what the unemployment rate is in China right now? 4.09%. Guess what it was last year? 4.09%, etc., etc. It's been 4.09% for about 7 years. You take that seriously, you know, God almighty, watch out for your pocket. So in that case, the published Chinese stats are nonsense about growth rates and so on. What we're really seeing in terms of the Baltic Dry Index, or if you really look at even the Chinese, some of the Chinese Communist Party officials themselves use private stats on energy use and so on to indicate what the real state of the Chinese economy is. So my major take is that's probably coming from China, but I can't say I studied the Baltic Dry Index as closely as I study private debt levels, of course.
Yeah, I mean, there's accusations in every official statistic of every government that it's stocked and manipulated to suit whatever figure they want. Let's talk about, there are many sort of alternative economists or social commentators who believe we should move to a gold-backed currencies, you know, away from the fiat system. They believe that the fiat system is going to break like the previous 600 in history have, and that we need some sort of backing. But you clearly don't see that we need a gold-based or precious metal-based economy to move forward. You see that we can manage the fiat system in a way that's going to be conducive to the health and vitality of not just the global economy, but also you know, the people, because the people have really suffered over the last 7-8 years and beyond. The poverty and whatnot has begun to increase again. For example, in Australia, it's slowly increasing. It went really well for so long, and now it's going backwards. So what do we do? How can we create a new economy? Does it have to be gold back, or can we move into fiat where we can start ruling out this socio-economic disadvantage that is plaguing society in general, and including you know, the lack of jobs as well?
Yeah, well, look, let's just talk about one of the problems about gold that people gloss over all the time, and that is that if you're going to have genuinely a gold-based economy, I mean, I don't certificates based on the backing of a certain amount of gold, but actually using physical gold, I think we can pretty rapidly rule out that we're going to be walking around handing pieces of metal to each other. But even if we did that, then to have the economy growing at a sustained rate over time, we'd need to be handing out smaller pieces of gold every time you went shopping for something. In other words, the price level would have to respond rather than the volume of gold, because the volume of gold can't respond. We know there's, you know, a fixed amount of gold on the planet. We can probably mine some more of it more effectively over time, but the mining costs are going to rise anyway. So once you have gold as your physical or absolutely one-to-one basis of exchange, the only way that you can have growth is by prices effectively falling, by deflation in terms of gold. Now, that capitalism doesn't work that way. It doesn't work well that way. Because we have, again, debt obligations, and again, with the debt obligations that exist would still be denominated with a gold foundation to them. People can't easily drop their prices, because you drop the prices too much, you know, you're going to be unable to service your debts, you're going to fold. So the price flexibility that's built into people's thinking about a gold standard isn't part of capitalism. And what tends to happen instead are booms and busts again, but given by inflation and deflation. If you go back to the 19th century, you'll see many, many more inflation and deflationary periods than we had in the 20th century. So capitalism needs a flexible monetary system somehow. And gold, a genuinely gold-based system, is not flexible enough. But equally, you need one which is understood by the people who manage it. And fiat money is not understood by the people who manage it. And a debt-based system on its own, which is fundamentally what we've been stuck with, given the incompetence of people who manage fiat money, debt-based money, even if that money is borrowed for genuinely sound purposes, like in other words, you're borrowing to invest rather than borrowing to speculate. So you're borrowing to build assets rather than to gamble on the price of assets. In my mathematical modeling, that sort of system can also have a debt crisis, because you can borrow too much during a boom, you're going to be able to pay it back during the slump, and after a series of booms and slumps, you have a crash. So you need some way to amend a debt-based system, and that's what fiat money itself should be doing, compensating for the weaknesses in debt-based money. But I really am honestly despairing of any possibility of our financial managers realizing that properly before the social breakdown that's caused by the dynamics we're seeing now overwhelms our societies. So I would like to see some form of privately created money that is not debt-based, as well as the debt-based system we have at the moment. I think that will then give us the flexibility. I'd like to see double entry bookkeeping created type money being created in a way that means that entrepreneurs can actually get investment finance, which at the moment they can't get, and also in a way that can do the sort of grand scale investment and technological work that the state used to do in the 50s and 60s that it refuses to do today. So, you know, I can't give any closed answers, but certainly I don't see going back to the gold standard as an answer. I see that as a cause of other problems.
When you say private money, do you mean, is that where you mean QE for the people, the helicopter money, or is that?
No, I mean private companies creating monetary systems that are not based on debt. Parallel currencies, in other words. And I know, actually, I know a couple of Australian groups, and I'm considering consulting to one of them, partly because I'm just giving up on. I mean, I never expected to persuade the mainstream of economics about how money actually operates, because I know you persuading the mainstream of anything is almost impossible. It's like persuading the basic thing. You're trying to persuade a Muslim that God is not Muhammad, and you know, or persuading the Pope that Jesus died. You know, you're pushing against a belief system which is so rigidly built into their brains they won't consider it. But I just look at this and think, if they don't actually realize how the system operates properly and then manage it properly, and QE, for example, is a sign that they're not managing it properly, then we're going to have social breakdown before we have any chance to reform the system. So I'm now happily supporting a number of private groups that are trying to create their own currency systems, because these are private entrepreneurs who have worked out how money operates and see both a catastrophe in our current situation, but also in a classic entrepreneurial way, an opportunity to make money, to profit, by offering an alternative means by which companies can exchange and get around the weaknesses of the current system where companies can't get money.
Well, from my own research, I think I remember there's about 6 local currencies in Australia, and in America, I think there's like 100 or a couple hundred. I can't remember from memory, but yeah. People do it. They do it in their own local area, their own community, and they grow their own food and create their own resources and barter and around their like necessary resources in that sense. So that could be the future.
Like, for example, one of the groups I know is it came out. It's called the barter card. You might be aware of that one, which called Royce Ritchie is an Australian entrepreneur who's been pushing and developing that as one system. There's another coming forward, which is going to be called, I think, IE Expert, which is a group I'm considering consulting to. So they're all finding ways in which you can create a double entry bookkeeping based system, which doesn't have to use fiat money or debt-based money as part of its transfer. So in the case of barter card, it originated out of tradies working for each other at a notional $10 an hour, and then developing credits which you get the plumber to come and do work on your house. If you, as an electrician, if you then go and do work on his house, and he'd do the plumbing, he'd do the wiring and that sort of thing, you'd get what you wanted without needing to transfer money. And barter card evolved out of that. IE Expert is a more, or IE Exchange, I think it's called, is a higher level concept of the same sort of thing. But what this is doing is enabling ordinary corporations to get the means by which they can pay for transactions, which should be provided by the fiat system, but is not being provided by it because the fiat system, the government's refusing to create enough money with its stupid obsessions on surpluses. Banks have created so much debt in the bubble so far, we've got no means to reduce that debt, so they won't extend credit either. So consequently, businesses are stuck. So I can't get it from the government, I can't get it from the banks. Bugger it, I'll get it myself.
Do Do you see there's a problem with private banking institutions creating money? I mean, fractional reserve lending essentially doesn't exist now. They just create the money and digitally create it and place it into the lender's account. Do you see there's a problem with that, and if so, do you think that the government should be managing like in Australia, the Reserve Bank of Australia, our central bank? I think they should be managing the creation of new money in society, so it isn't debt based and instead is asset backed.
I'm an enormous distance from being a fan of the Reserve Bank of Australia. You're probably aware. I think that it's probably as bad as the Federal Reserve in terms of understanding the monetary system. So the thought of leaving the control of money in the hand of bureaucrats and mainstream economic thinkers doesn't exactly excite me. I do see a need for private money creation as well as government money creation. But with private money creation, you have a growth of debt. That means that at some point people don't want to take any more debt, and then it terminates, which is where we are now. So I would like, you also with private debt created money, those sorts of banks, because they only if they get an interest rate return for extending principal, they create the principal out of nothing. That's the basis of the whole thing. Double entry bookkeeping. They create a loan on one side, deposit on the other, and they've made the money that way. They don't need to borrow from us or to get our deposits to make that creation. But when you get to we've accumulated the amount of debt we have now, people are no longer willing to take on more debt, so it freezes. Now, and also, they're not going to be willing to lend to entrepreneurs, because if you lend to entrepreneurs, if you're lucky, 1 out of 5 of them will survive. You lose your principal on 4 of them. You only make interest on the 5th. It's just not worth your while. So I would like to see banks being able to create money for entrepreneurs, and rather than getting a debt-based stake in the company, get an equity-based stake in the company. And therefore, if the company folds, they lose their equity, as they do now with the loan. But if the company succeeds, their equity expands dramatically in value, which doesn't happen right now. And that would encourage banks to lend to entrepreneurs. So I'd like to do something like that, and then have banks making the decisions about what entrepreneurs are worth funding, or to go to crowdsourcing and develop crowdsourcing in such a fashion that we all got that capacity to create money by making an entry up to a certain amount of cash per person in things like Vimeo, what's it called, I've forgotten, the Kickstarter and those sorts of organizations. We need to create money in a way that gets it to entrepreneurs. So I'd like to do that, and then have the bureaucrats as well creating fiat money on the basis of the needs we have for infrastructural development, education, health, welfare, et cetera, but just going to one or the other, I think, is a disaster. But I want to have a balanced system where there's both private money creation and government money creation. At the moment, we've got the worst of both worlds. Private money creation just on the basis of debt, which 97% of which finances access speculation and not genuine investment, and doesn't provide working capital for companies. On the other side, we have a government believing it should run surpluses, which is taking money out of the economy and not providing the infrastructure development we need. So you have Americans complaining about lousy roads, and justifiably so, and declining infrastructure and poor education, et cetera. We've got the worst of 2 possible worlds right now. But the trouble is, when people go for the best of a possible world, what people tend to go for is one extreme or the other. They go for totally gold-based and abolish fiat money, et cetera, at one extreme. Or you get the positive money, which people I like over in England, I appreciate, and they're very flexible in their thinking. But other groups go for entirely government-created money. I think both of them are going to have, they lead to their own flawed outcomes. So I'm more of a yin and yang type when it comes to my final proposal.
The Australian Sovereignty Party, which is a revamped political outfit in Australia, they've got a monetary policy around this issue, where essentially what they have said is that we've got about $77,000 per head within the economy, in the economy at the moment. If people start paying off their debt, that wipes out about $80 billion per year. What they want is the private banks to stop the creation of new money. They can only lend out what has been legitimately deposited in the bank, but what they can lend out, what they can't lend out, they can get through reserves from the Reserve Bank of Australia. The Reserve Bank of Australia creates that at $80 billion, as well as an additional 40 for population growth and also immigration and whatnot per annum. So essentially there's $120 billion extra per year that is being wiped off the debt, and that 120 billion has to be reinvested into the economy via infrastructure projects only. Now, to put that into context, I think it was around the last 15 years, the Australian government has spent about $45 billion on infrastructure. So if we were to spend $120 billion a year on infrastructure, you could just imagine what sort of roads, rail, we could green the desert. There's a whole gamut of necessary functions that we need, but we don't have the infrastructural capability to do so. So what do you think about that policy?
Well, I mean, partly believing that that's a bit like positive money in England in that sense. To actually make it work, you'd have to give individuals accounts at the Reserve Bank to make that work functionally. So it's possible to do it. It's feasible. What you then have to be aware of is that if you then have that type of boost to a domestic economy, then you've got to worry about your trade balance. Because if we actually pump that amount of money out and then we imported Japanese and Chinese goods to provide that infrastructure, then we'd have a current account collapse. We'd have a huge current account deficit, which could affect the dollar value, et cetera, and you would not have any. You'd only get to the stage where you might have a plunging currency, unless you were actually also building the domestic capability to produce those goods. So it's a potential avenue, but let's not do it without being aware of the three sectors that are involved. So people often will come up with ideas like that and not consider the external sector, although I obsess about the government deficit, or in my case, of course, I obsess about level of private debt. But there are three factors there. So that sort of system would address the private debt problem to some extent. You would have the money creation the government should be doing for infrastructure actually achieving, which is good. But then you have to say, what's going to happen to our trade balance? Now, if you run a project like that on your own, like no other country does it, then your currency, you are likely to have a balance of payment, a balance of trade collapse, much larger deficits, which will then undermine your currency and then mean the cost of bringing those goods in will rise. So you undermine the actual projects you're trying to establish. So to do it at the same time, you need to have a policy about currency devaluation or about industrial development. So it needs to be more completely thought out than you've told me so far. I'm not opposed to it, but I want to see those thorough working outs of the macroeconomic and international trade consequences of what people are proposing.
That's something I might be able to give you some more details on. The other policy, the big policy, they got two pillars to the economic policy, and the other one is the taxation system. Now, we know a lot of people, most people are pretty angry at multinational and banking structures. The oligarchs is another term that is thrown around, and their evasion of tax. What they've suggested is, instead of having 125 federal, state and local taxes like we do in Australia, remove all those except for import and export tariffs, and do something called a transaction debit tax at 2%. Now, what they've estimated is at the moment there's about $50 trillion worth of monetary flow, cash flow through the economy each year, with around 12 trillion that gets wiped out from a lack of, from a decrease in speculative spending by the banks and the financial institutions. Yeah. That leaves about $38 trillion to have a 2% tax base on, and that sort of wipes out loopholes and offshore accounts and other sneaky tactics to evade tax, where everybody has a blanket rate of 2% tax. I think another name for it is the Tobin tax and the Robin Hood tax. So I think they were considering it quite seriously in Europe over the last few years. But their model suggests that through their monetary policy of $120 billion, as well as which is 80 billion in creation, 80 plus $40 billion in creation that goes straight into infrastructure, as well as 750 billion that comes through the transaction tax, and I think there's another 20 or so which comes through the import taxes and whatnot. So all up, they get a revenue base of $910 billion annual to reinvigorate manufacturing, reinvigorate jobs, reinvigorate local, state and national economies, and really sort of revitalise the way that we operate in Australia. So what do you think of that approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, this comes down to partly what's called modern monetary theory. People, I think, now have got some criticisms of part of modern monetary theory, but the basic argument they have is that the government doesn't need to tax to spend, and that's correct. So a lot of these visions about how to fix things up by reforming the taxation system imply the government needs to tax before it can spend. In fact, it can spend, its spending creates the need for it to tax to take what it creates back out of the system again. The real function of taxation in that sense is redistribution of income. And I recommend people take a look at a book by George Cooper, who's become a good mate of mine over here in England. He's an ex-physicist, and I think he was Goldman Sachs trader, who's now become a critic of the monetary system. I have a book called Blood, Money and Revolution, and he talks about how he sees the democratic state as an essential part of a successful capitalist economy, because if you have just the mechanisms of capitalism itself, a pure private enterprise system, will concentrate wealth and then lead to, effectively, it's a bit like blood not circulating, all ending up in the head or the legs, the body dies. So he sees taxation as being a way of redistributing it from where it tends to get coagulate and then keep it circulating. Now, on that basis, a flat tax doesn't look like it cuts the mustard. However, because we have so many transnational corporations which are very blithely evading domestic taxation and transferring their profits off to the Bahamas and places like that, and like, I think I've seen some corporations earn 98% of their profits in the Caribbean. I mean, give me a break. That's just managed to sidestep income tax by shifting around their costs and their revenues and so on, and preventing a fictional set of accounts. Google's been through this experience in England recently. That's much harder with a transaction tax. It's much harder for them to get around it. So I have a transaction tax appeals to me as a way of stopping that happening, because that, in that sense, trying to do it with income tax when corporations can so easily evade it, ends up having the effect that George is trying to stop, of all the money coagulating in some particular spot and not circulating. So a transaction tax as a component of the taxation system makes sense to me. What I'd rather do than just have a flat, complete replace all income taxes with transaction taxes, it has some system which is basically either or. Either you pay a minimum level of an income tax, or you pay a minimum level of a transaction tax. You can't get below one without triggering the other. So if Google managed to get around the income taxes by declaring ludicrously small profits in Australia or England, they'd be hit by the transaction tax, which they couldn't get around. And on the other hand, if they had income tax above the transaction tax, they'd pay the income tax level. So I think a hybrid system, again, makes more sense than a complete switchover.
All right, so but clearly the model that I just put forward is a much better, more progressive sort of system model that we've got today. It does rip out a few of the issues, particularly around big money evading the way that we operate, but also the infrastructure projects that we do have. So do you see what I put forward as at least a legitimate approach if it was to deal with some of the concerns that you had? Yeah,
like, it's legitimate. It's it needs a bit more thought, but it's a sensible injection into the debate. It's certainly more sensible than bloody Malcolm Turnbull's recent suggestion of handing over taxation rights back to the states again. I mean, I read this stuff. That's what you call innovative thinking? Give me a break. We got rid of state taxes back, I think it was before the Second World War, from memory, for the need to finance the war effort. And it's just nonsense to think that that's tax reform. Whereas at least something like the transaction tax is a new element and could overcome some of the problems we do actually have with our current taxation system.
We live in crazy town, Steve. It's a backwards world where the mainstream, as you put it before, are heavily indoctrinated into their ideological belief systems and whatnot, and it's very difficult to enact change. Now, let's move on to QE for the people, right? Now, I remember you saying that you don't believe that there is a crisis imminent. Now, let me tell you, in the alternative community on the YouTube channels and whatnot, it is ballistic. People are going crazy thinking it was going to happen yesterday, now, tomorrow, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. There's a lot of energy around the Fiat system breaking down. And it scares the shit out of a lot of people. There's a lot of people worried about it. So if there was to be a derivatives implosion, some sort of stock market collapse, something, if we do go into a heavily deflationary environment and jobs are lost and whatnot, what do you propose that we should do in response to that crisis?
Well, if you have it, I mean, we saw it happen back in 2008. You had a whole bunch of mainstream thinkers who argued that the government should play a minimal role in the economy, etc., etc. Then the crisis hit, which they had absolutely no idea was going to happen, and they suddenly turned into the Keynesians on steroids, throwing as much money as they could at the economy, mainly, of course, at the financial system. The banks managed to persuade them to throw it their way than not. But any crisis like that, the behavior of people in control is, I don't want to go down in history as a person who destroyed capitalism. And like if you read Hank Paulson's book On the Brink, or if you talk to, as I've done, Ed Lazaire, who was Bush's economic advisor at the time, they'll tell you that the mood inside the White House and the mood inside the Federal Reserve was sheer panic. Okay, total, absolute, if I can use a French word here, what the fuck is going on? Panic. We've got to do something. We don't want the system to collapse on our watch. Throw as much money as we can. Hank Paulson, for example, this is pretty much a quote from his book, said that he went to Congress saying he needed $700 billion, and he needed it he rented it straight now. Otherwise, the system was going to fold. And he said, I used $700 billion. I knew that using a large number could cause cardiac arrest. So he didn't say trillion. That's the only reason he didn't say $1 trillion. It went for 700 billion. He said, I was asked what would happen if the money wasn't created. And he said, may God have mercy on our souls. Okay, so that's the state of mind they'll be in if another one hits. They'll do the same thing or something very similar. They may be cockier about it because the last one transparently worked. They might not do enough. So I don't see a total breakdown coming. What I do see is inadequate responses to the state of stagnation we're in now, and preserving a cause of that stagnation, which is too much private bank debt, in the belief that that's a good thing, and trying to create more private bank debt in the belief that's a good thing. And therefore they will continue stumbling along like Japan has done. So I don't see a total breakdown, but I do see permanent stagnation on a Japanese scale. Mind you, I do see 7 countries that I think are going to have a debt crisis. I mentioned that in my most recent article on Forbes. So that was Australia. They've got to go from the top. China, definitely, because it's got the biggest level of private debt and rate of growth of private debt. Australia came number 2. Hong Kong was number 3. 4, from memory, was Canada. Then we had Norway, Sweden, and South Korea. So I see those 7 countries having an actual debt crisis coming their way. But the rest of the world, stagnation, not the huge crisis.
All right, so if it hits Australia, what do we do? Is this where QE for the people comes in? What is your approach to deal with?
That's the one I'd go for. I mean, we have to reduce the level of private debt. That's the bottom line to getting a successful capitalist system, is having a lower level of private debt than I've got right now. And since it's created out of nothing, it can effectively be remedied out of nothing as well. The government's capacity to create money also in a double entry bookkeeping way by making it a direct injection into people's accounts, which means the government would record a deficit. That can be used to counteract the level of private debt. Then the real issue you've got is what happens to your trade balance. That's really the one you've got to be careful about, in which case currency devaluation would be required, and industrial policies to help build up an industrial sector here, which of course we've managed to eliminate in the belief that we can be based on both services and mining. or mining's gone down the tube, and we're all trying to be real estate agents selling to each other. That doesn't work either. You've got to have that capability to produce as well. So there are three balances to look at: the government deficit, which should be a deficit. Bank debt we've got to reduce drastically, but you then want banks to be lending money. Your third level is the trade deficit, and you don't want to have one going through the roof, which is Australia's great weakness. We don't have the industrial base to avoid that. So I'd use QE for the people, but I'd then be bringing in additional controls to make sure you reduce private debt using that mechanism. And then also, you've got to watch to make sure you don't have a blowout in trade deficit.
So there's been the modern debt jubilee term, phrase thrown around a lot over the last sort of few years. It's really increased within the alternative media. So is a QE for the people, is helicopter money, is it the same thing, or is it a little bit?
I coined the phrase the modern debt jubilee. So the modern debt jubilee differs by the requirement that anybody who's in debt, who gets that injection of money from state-created money, must use that to pay their debt down. So that's an additional one. I'm glad it's getting there. I'm actually quite surprised how much attention it got. I thought it would never get considered anywhere. But nonetheless, it was a sensible idea. So I'm glad to see it's being debated, and hopefully it will come to fruition. That would solve our problems, but no solution is without its own consequences.
Now, one other real serious thing that are on the mind of Australians, what's going on with the housing bubble? There was a big blow up about it over the last sort of month, where people saying, yeah, we've got a bubble, and there's other people going, no, we don't be stupid. You know, it's just, it's an absolute circus. People have no idea what to talk about, what to say when it comes to the housing bubble. So what is your perspective on it?
Okay, I've just actually produced a paper with a good friend of mine, Paul Onrod, and Paul and a colleague did the econometrics on this paper. So it should be turning up on a thing called Archive, ARKXIV, I think it's called, as a research paper shortly. And in that, I've been arguing for a long time that what actually drives housing is the acceleration of mortgage debt, not the change, the acceleration of mortgage debt. I'll explain the logic in a second. But Paul and I think Richard, have done the econometrics on that, and they've confirmed my argument that what causes house prices to rise is accelerating mortgage debt. And equally, what causes house prices to fall is decelerating mortgage debt. So I'll take you through the logic. But what it means is people say, oh, there can't be a bubble because it hasn't burst yet. Okay, that's this. Now the prices are still rising, therefore there can't be a bubble. They think, excuse me, if I'm pumping up a balloon, you're going to say the balloon's not going to burst until it bursts? That's really helpful, you know? That's really thanks for the insight there, guys. So what I'm saying is, well, you can define a bubble if you understand what's actually causing it to expand or contract. And if its cause of expansion necessarily leads to it exploding, if it keeps on going, then you have a bubble. So the logic goes, and I'm starting straight from simple old supply and demand, but I'm actually thinking about it rather than just using the phrases like a parrot, which is the way most people on the discussing housing bubbles do. So the supply of housing is basically turnover of existing stock plus new housing being created. That's your supply side. There's a flow of houses onto the market coming mainly out of the turnover of existing houses, but also there's new construction. Then on the demand side, it's fundamentally a flow of new mortgages. There's a fraction of people who buy with cash, and those who buy with debt have a fraction of cash as well. But fundamentally, demand for housing is new mortgages. So your demand is change in mortgage debt, and your supply is the flow of houses onto the market. Prices then are the mechanism that modifies if there's a big imbalance between the demand and the supply. So you divide the flow of new mortgages by the price level, and that's going to be have influence one way or the other on the supply, which is this flow of turnover of existing houses fundamentally. So when you work it out, you've got a relationship therefore between the flow of mortgage debt and the level of house prices. So the change in mortgage debt and the level of house prices. Then you say what's going to cause house prices to rise. It's fundamentally going to be the change in mortgage debt, which is its acceleration. I've done the econometrics, and it's clear that even using a very conservative technology to work out what is the causal process does do rising house prices cause accelerating mortgage debt? Or does accelerating mortgage debt cause rising house prices? The answer came back categorically: accelerating mortgage debt causes rising house prices. Therefore, to have rising house prices, you have to have accelerating mortgage debt. Now, I hope I don't need to explain that acceleration can't go on forever. Okay? Even if you have an enormous level to which people can actually carry mortgage debt compared to income, nobody's going to argue that the average Australian person can hold mortgage debt equivalent to 100 times their income. It's just not going to happen. So there's some level you're going to taper at. And empirically, again, it looks at though a level of mortgage debt of the order of 1 to 1.5 times GDP is about it, as far as any country's ever got in history in carrying your mortgage debt. Therefore, as you approach that level, which is if you're approaching with rising velocity, your velocity has to start tapering at some point to reach that maximum. And the turning point is where your acceleration becomes negative. Okay, if you're driving a car, I mean, imagine you're in this, Ferrari, or you're in a Tesla. You put the foot to the floor in ludicrous mode. There's a period where your acceleration is rising, and then your acceleration starts to fall, and then you go maximum speed. The turning point in this S curve, that's where acceleration peaks. Okay. Same thing for mortgage debt. When you hit that point, then your house prices start falling because your acceleration is dropping past that point. So Australia's hitting that point pretty much now, I think. And therefore, we're going to see falling house prices. Now, of course, that causes all sorts of feedbacks. Once you start having falling house prices, what happens to people's willingness to go into debt? It plummets. So you get a total break in the series. And that's what happened in America in 2006, 2007. It's what happened in Spain, in Ireland, et cetera, et cetera. And we've done the same thing all the way through. We've only managed to keep it going for longer because government policies continued encouraging people to get back into debt and has kept that acceleration positive. But I think we've almost reached the limits. So when it does downgo house prices, with a bit of help in the opposite direction from Chinese buying quite possibly, and the government can extend things by cutting reserve, can cut interest rates by another 2%, which they could also end up doing. So these things can attenuate it and slow it down, but ultimately you have to reach the point where your acceleration turns negative, starts to decline. And when that happens, then your house prices are going to fall.
Well, sooner the better, in my view. Look, too many people spend too much on rent. Some people spend over half of their wage on just housing themselves. Is there anything else that you think is important that we discuss either in an Australian context or in a global economic context?
Oh, there's, I mean, we could go on forever, mate, but I've got to stop at some point. That'll do, I think, for today. The main thing is that we're facing a whole range of tipping points here. And one major problem of being caught in the financial bubble, as we have been this time round, is it's coinciding with us putting enormous pressure on the ecology of the planet at the same time. And by having devoting our time to finance and speculation and gambling about prices, rather than creating new innovative concepts as humanity's great strength, when the ecological crisis hits, we won't have the engineers and the scientists we should have had to help us work our way out of it. So that's the real crisis, is that by obsessing about paper wealth, we've managed to not increase humanity's genuine wealth. And we're now facing a time we absolutely desperately need that. So we're going to pay two prices for this financial bubble, not only one, and the bigger one by far is the ecological.
Yep, absolutely agree. It's been a sort of rough road over the last sort of 10, 20 years economically, and we really do have some tools that we can use to mitigate the issues in the economy at the moment, as well as design something really, really positive and helpful and healthy for ourselves and the environment as we move on. So let's throw away these old schools of thought, these old ways of doing things, and understand these tools are right here. There are alternative economists like yourself and proponents of MMT and others, political outfits of the Australian Sovereignty Party, are really trying to usher in a new way of dealing with the economic problems, because everyone is concerned about this stuff. When it comes to their wallet, let me tell you, everyone has their say. So I think if we start opening a dialogue throughout mainstream society, throughout the masses, not
Mhm.
perpetuate these old narratives, these unhealthy narratives that continue to shape public consensus, and start putting this new stuff on the table so that we can start really nutting out, getting all the experts, all the academics, all the politicians involved, and actually start making some serious changes as we move forward.
Yep, mind you, there won't be. It won't go down. This double bubble won't go quietly into the night. It'll do a lot of kicking and screaming, and it's about time that Dave Gibbons got kicked by your generation.
Well, let's see if people are going to wake up and stand up, eh? So thank you, Steve. Really appreciate you joining me on the Conscious Society.
You're welcome. I'll get back to other work now.
See you next time.
Okay, bye.